This is the next chapter of the story. If you haven't watched my previous video, The Rise of the Medici, how bankers became Europe's most powerful family, go watch that one first, because that's where we followed the Medici from their beginnings as bankers to the moment they had laid the foundations of their extraordinary influence over Florence. Now, continuing from where we left off, one of the greatest achievements of the Renaissance. One of the first people to benefit from this new atmosphere was the architect Filippo Brunelleschi. For decades, Florence's cathedral had stood unfinished because nobody knew how to build the enormous dome that was supposed to cover it. Many believed the project was simply impossible, and for years the empty space remained as a reminder of an engineering problem no one could solve. Brunelleschi proposed a daring solution that many experts doubted would work. Instead of relying on the massive wooden supports used in traditional construction, he designed an innovative double shell dome that could support itself as it rose. It was an idea unlike anything Europe had seen for centuries. Cosimo believed in ambitious ideas, even when others called them impossible. By supporting projects that pushed the limits of architecture, engineering, and art, he helped create a culture where innovation was encouraged instead of feared. Florence slowly became a city where brilliant minds knew they would be given the opportunity to experiment. Around the same time, another extraordinary artist was transforming Florence. His name was Donatello, and unlike earlier sculptors who often produced rigid and symbolic figures, Donatello filled his work with movement, emotion, and realism. His sculptures looked startlingly alive, as though stone itself had learned to breathe. None of these achievements happened in isolation. Architects inspired painters. Sculptors exchanged ideas with scholars. Wealth created stability. Stability encouraged creativity, and creativity attracted even more talented people to Florence. The city was becoming something Europe had rarely seen before, a place where art, science, business, and philosophy all grew together. Visitors arriving in Florence could feel that something unusual was happening. The city was no longer known only for its merchants or its banks. It was becoming a destination for anyone with ambition. Artists came looking for patrons, scholars arrived searching for forgotten knowledge, and young apprentices traveled from distant towns, hoping to build a future in the most exciting city in Europe. Cosimo rarely stood at the center of these achievements, and that was exactly how he preferred it. He understood that people remembered magnificent buildings and timeless works of art far longer than they remembered political speeches. By helping others create greatness, he quietly ensured that the Medici name would be remembered alongside every masterpiece they made possible. His influence reached far beyond art. Hospitals received donations, monasteries expanded their libraries, public buildings were restored, and families struggling through difficult times often found unexpected support through Medici generosity. Every act of patronage strengthened the family's connection to Florence itself. By the middle of the 15th century, Florence had become the cultural capital of Europe. Travelers returned home describing a city unlike any other, where business funded beauty, knowledge was celebrated, and remarkable ideas seemed to appear around every street corner. The Renaissance was no longer beginning. It was flourishing. When Cosimo de' Medici died in 1464, he left behind far more than the wealthiest bank in Europe. He had transformed Florence into the intellectual center of the Renaissance and proved that influence could be built through generosity instead of conquest. Yet the greatest chapter of the Medici story was still waiting to be written, because the next generation would produce a leader remembered simply as the Magnificent. Cosimo's death could have marked the end of everything he had spent a lifetime building, but the foundations he left behind were remarkably strong. His son, Piero de' Medici, inherited the family's enormous responsibilities at a time when Europe still admired Florence as the center of finance, learning, and artistic innovation. Although Piero's health prevented him from matching his father's energy, he managed to preserve the stability that Cosimo had carefully created. Piero ruled for only 5 years before illness finally overcame him. But during that short time, he successfully guided the family through several financial and political challenges. More importantly, he prepared his eldest son for the responsibility that would soon change both Florence and the Renaissance forever. In 1469, at just 20 years old, Lorenzo de' Medici inherited the leadership of the family. Many expected his youth to become a weakness, but they underestimated both his intelligence and his ambition. Lorenzo possessed an unusual combination of political instinct, artistic appreciation, and diplomatic skill that would earn him a name remembered for centuries. History would remember him as Lorenzo the Magnificent, not because he conquered foreign kingdoms or expanded Florence through war, but because he understood that ideas, culture, and diplomacy could create a legacy far greater than military victories. Under his leadership, Florence entered what many historians consider its greatest golden age. Lorenzo believed that supporting brilliant people was one of the wisest investments a leader could make. Rather than filling his palace with displays of wealth, he filled it with philosophers, poets, scientists, architects, and artists who challenged one another with new ideas. His court became one of the greatest centers of learning anywhere in Europe. Among the many young talents who benefited from Lorenzo's patronage was a teenage sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti. Lorenzo recognized his extraordinary ability long before the rest of Europe did, and invited him to live at the Medici Palace, where he could study ancient sculptures, learn from leading scholars, and develop the skills that would eventually produce some of history's greatest masterpieces. Lorenzo understood something that many rulers overlooked. Great artists were not simply creating beautiful objects. They were shaping how future generations would remember an entire civilization. Every painting, sculpture, poem, and building funded during his lifetime strengthened Florence's reputation as the cultural capital of Europe. While Florence celebrated art and learning, political tensions continued to grow beneath the surface. Rival banking families had never accepted the Medici's dominance, and some believed the only way to restore their own influence was to remove Lorenzo permanently. Quiet conversations began taking place behind closed doors, and before long, those conversations became a conspiracy. The plot was organized by members of the powerful Pazzi family with support from several influential allies who believed Florence could never be free while the Medici remained in control. Their plan was terrifyingly simple: kill Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano at the same moment, throw the city into chaos, and seize power before anyone could respond. The conspirators chose Easter Sunday in 1478, knowing that the Medici brothers would almost certainly attend Mass inside Florence Cathedral. Surrounded by hundreds of worshippers, they believed nobody would expect violence in one of the city's holiest places. It was the perfect opportunity, or so they thought. As the church service reached its most sacred moment, the conspirators made their move. Blades were drawn in the middle of the cathedral. Panic spread through the congregation, and within seconds Florence was transformed from a place of worship into a scene of chaos. Giuliano de' Medici was attacked first, suffering multiple stab wounds before collapsing to the stone floor. The assassins immediately turned toward Lorenzo, hoping to finish the attack before anyone could react. But unlike his brother, Lorenzo managed to defend himself long enough for loyal friends to surround him. They rushed him through a side passage and locked the heavy doors behind them. saving his life by only a matter of moments. News of the failed assassination spread across Florence almost instantly. Citizens poured into the streets, church bells rang throughout the city, and confusion quickly turned into anger. Many Florentines believed the attack was not simply an assault on one family, but an attack on the stability and future of Florence itself. Within hours, the conspiracy completely collapsed. Many of the conspirators were captured before they could escape, while others attempted to flee the city. Lorenzo's supporters moved quickly, restoring order and ensuring that the Medici remained firmly in control despite the shocking events that had unfolded earlier that day. Lorenzo emerged from the tragedy as an even stronger leader than before. Surviving an assassination attempt earned him enormous public sympathy, and many citizens now viewed him as the man who had protected Florence during one of its darkest moments. Ironically, the conspiracy designed to destroy the Medici ended up making their position stronger than ever. After surviving the conspiracy, Lorenzo understood that Florence faced dangers not only from rivals within the city, but also from powerful enemies beyond its walls. Several Italian states, and even the papacy, viewed the Medici with increasing suspicion. Instead of answering every threat with war, Lorenzo relied on diplomacy, believing that a well-negotiated peace could achieve what years of fighting never could. Lorenzo personally traveled to Naples, placing himself in considerable danger to negotiate directly with King Ferdinand I. Many believed the journey was reckless, but Lorenzo understood that preventing a devastating war would protect Florence far more effectively than sending thousands of soldiers into battle. His gamble succeeded, and peace was restored. The peace Lorenzo secured allowed Florence to continue flourishing, while many other regions struggled with conflict. Trade expanded, artists continued working, scholars exchanged ideas freely, and the city's economy remained strong because stability gave people the confidence to invest in the future instead of worrying about survival. By the late 15th century, visitors across Europe regarded Florence as the place where the future was being created. Its bankers financed international commerce, its artists redefined beauty, its architects transformed skylines, and its scholars revived knowledge that had been forgotten for centuries. At the center of all of it stood the Medici family. Looking around Florence in the 1480s, it would have been easy to believe that the Medici had achieved something impossible. They had risen from ordinary merchants to become the most influential family in Italy without ever formally becoming kings. Their wealth had transformed a city, inspired a cultural revolution, and reshaped European history. It seemed as though nothing could ever threaten their dynasty. But even at the height of their success, the Medici dynasty was beginning to develop a problem that money alone could not solve. Lorenzo had inherited an enormous financial and political machine, but maintaining that machine required constant spending, constant diplomacy, and constant attention. The family's power looked permanent from the outside, yet beneath the surface, the foundations were becoming more complicated. The Medici Bank was still enormously successful, but banking across medieval Europe was never completely safe. Loans could fail, political relationships could change, wars could disrupt trade routes, and distant branches were difficult to supervise. The larger the network became, the harder it was to control every decision made in the family's name. Lorenzo also spent enormous amounts of money supporting Florence's cultural life. Artists, scholars, festivals, diplomatic missions, public projects, and political allies all required funding, and the Medici name had become so closely connected with generosity that withdrawing that support could damage the family's reputation. Yet, Lorenzo's greatest achievement was not financial. It was cultural. One new email, he had helped create an environment where people believed that human beings could understand the world through reason, observation, creativity, and study. That idea would spread far beyond Florence, eventually influencing European art, science, philosophy, and education. And this is where the Medici story becomes bigger than one family. Their greatest legacy was not simply the fortune they accumulated or the political influence they exercised. It was the world they helped create, a world in which artistic genius could receive financial support. Ancient knowledge could be rediscovered, and ambitious thinkers could challenge ideas that had remained unquestioned for generations. Lorenzo's personal reputation also grew far beyond Florence. Foreign rulers wanted his friendship, scholars sought his correspondence, and artists competed for the opportunity to work under his protection. He had become something rare in Renaissance Europe, a political leader whose influence came not only from money, but from culture and personal relationships. His palace became a meeting place where completely different worlds collided. A philosopher could debate a poet in the morning, an artist could show a new sculpture in the afternoon, and a diplomat could arrive that evening to discuss the balance of power in Italy. The Medici residence had effectively become an unofficial center of European culture and politics. But Lorenzo's influence also made the Medici impossible to ignore. Their allies had become dependent on them. Their rivals feared them, and foreign powers watched their every move. The family had reached a point where even doing nothing could be interpreted as a political decision. Then, in 1492, Lorenzo's health began to fail. He was only 43 years old, but years of political pressure, financial responsibility, and constant activity had taken their toll. The man who had guided Florence through its golden age was suddenly forced to confront a problem that no amount of money or influence could solve. Lorenzo died on April 8, 1492, at the age of 43. Florence lost the man who had become its unofficial leader, and the Renaissance lost one of its greatest patrons. But perhaps the most important question was what would happen next, because Lorenzo's successor did not possess his father's diplomatic talent or political authority. Lorenzo's death created an immediate problem for the Medici family. His eldest son, Piero, inherited the enormous responsibility of leading Florence. One new email, but he had grown up in a world where his father's reputation had opened almost every door for him. Now those doors were no longer opening automatically, and Piero would soon discover that maintaining power was very different from inheriting it, and the timing could hardly have been worse. Across Europe, political alliances were shifting. Powerful monarchies were becoming more aggressive, and Florence was surrounded by states that were always searching for an opportunity to improve their own position. Lorenzo had spent decades balancing these forces, but Piero had barely begun learning the game. Then came the event that would expose just how fragile Florence's political position had become. In 1494, the French king Charles VII invaded Italy with a powerful army, claiming the right to the throne of Naples. Suddenly, Florence found itself caught between a foreign king and the Italian states trying to stop him. Piero faced a decision that could determine the future of the Medici dynasty. He could resist the French army and risk destroying Florence in a war it could not easily win, or he could negotiate and hope that surrendering certain positions would preserve the city. Piero chose negotiation, but the terms he accepted were so generous to the French that many Florentines believed he had betrayed them. The reaction was immediate. The same city that had once welcomed the Medici as protectors now turned against them. Crowds gathered in the streets. Political opponents demanded that Piero leave, and the family's carefully constructed authority began collapsing with astonishing speed. In November 1494, Piero was forced to flee Florence. The Medici palace was seized, the family was expelled from the city, and the dynasty that had dominated Florence for generations suddenly found itself without a home. The rise of the Medici had taken more than a century, but their first great fall had happened in a matter of days. And yet, the story was far from finished. The Medici had lost Florence, but they had not lost their name, their wealth, their connections, or their ambition. Their descendants would eventually return, regain political power, become dukes and grand dukes of Tuscany, and place members of the family on the throne of France and even in the papacy. Their rise had begun with a banker who understood that trust could become wealth, continued with a family that turned wealth into influence and reached its cultural peak when the Medici used that influence to finance an intellectual revolution. They had never needed an army to conquer Europe, because their greatest achievement was convincing Europe to remember their name. The House of Medici had risen from the world of merchants and bankers to become one of the most influential dynasties in European history. They changed Florence, transformed the arts, supported the revival of ancient knowledge, and proved that financial power could become political and cultural power. But every dynasty eventually discovers that building an empire and keeping it are two completely different challenges. The Medici had reached the summit. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because the story of the Medici is far from over.